The cabin by the lake had always been a place of quiet escape, a retreat from noise, from work, from the routines that drained life of its spark. The cabin stood there for decades, passed down through generations, its wooden beams worn smooth by time and its dock stretching out into the shimmering water. For the narrator and his wife, it wasn't just a cabin, it was a sanctuary. But sanctuaries have a way of drawing attention, especially the wrong kind, and in their case, that attention came from the local homeowners association. When they first bought the property, the HOA had little involvement with their cabin. It was technically outside the primary development, but still within reach of the overreaching rules that the HOA president, a woman whose neighbors had nicknamed Karen, behind her back was determined to enforce. She had built her identity around control. Her days revolved around scanning yards, measuring fences, and ensuring every resident knew she was watching. At first, she seemed to ignore the lake cabin. It was too secluded, too tucked away behind trees and winding dirt paths. But the moment the couple decided to change the gate lock, the cabin suddenly became her business. The old iron gate had been there since the narrator's grandfather owned the land. Rust chewed at the hinges, the lock barely worked, and strangers had been spotted wandering close to the cabin grounds in recent months. His wife, pragmatic and protective, insisted on securing it properly. She bought a new lock, one that actually worked, and installed it herself on a breezy Saturday morning. It should have been the simplest of chores, the kind of thing anyone would do to protect their property. But for Karen, it was something else entirely. She saw the act not as maintenance, but as rebellion. The HOA had not given permission. No paperwork had been filed. No form had been approved. By the following afternoon, her silver SUV was parked just outside the gate, angled aggressively as though her vehicle alone was a barricade. She was seen pacing, taking photos and scribbling on a notepad. The couple had no idea that in her mind, this was already escalating into a battle. The call came in on Monday. The local sheriff's office received a complaint of suspicious activity at the lake cabin. The report described a woman tampering with a community gate lock, though the gate in question had never belonged to the HOA. Karen had twisted the story to make it sound as though private property was public domain, and the sheriff had no choice but to investigate. That was when the narrator's wife first noticed the patrol car easing down the dirt path. The tires crackled against gravel, the sound echoing strangely across the water. The officer stepped out, not aggressively, but with the cautious stance of someone responding to a potential crime. It wasn't long before confusion turned into irritation because nothing about the scene suggested criminal behavior. A woman had changed a lock on her own gate. That was all. But Karen wasn't satisfied. She had positioned herself at the end of the road, arms folded, watching with the smug patience of someone waiting for validation. She expected the officers to back her authority, to confirm her suspicions, to punish the neighbor who dared defy her unspoken rules. Instead, she was told it was private property. Instead, she was reminded that homeowners could secure their land however they pleased. Instead, she was left seething in her SUV as the patrol car rolled away, leaving her without the satisfaction of victory. But that was only the beginning. The narrator and his wife didn't yet realize that by changing a single lock, they had drawn a line in the sand. What was, to them, a simple act of safety had become to Karen an outright declaration of war. She began walking the property lines more often, carrying a clipboard as if her notes gave her authority. Neighbors whispered that she had been circulating emails, urging the HOA board to take swift action. Then came the letters. Folded sheets slipped into their mailbox, printed with officious language and stamped with the HOA logo. The first demanded immediate removal of unauthorized alterations. The second warned of fines. The third threatened legal escalation. Each letter was more aggressive than the last, and though the cabin technically fell outside her jurisdiction, Karen had convinced enough of the board members to play along. For the narrator's wife, the absurdity of it all was both infuriating and exhausting. She had done nothing wrong. The lock was hers. The gate was theirs. Yet somehow, every trip to the cabin now came with the sour taste of hostility. She noticed Karen's SUV parked more often near the entrance. She noticed photos being taken whenever they came and went. And she noticed the way other neighbors seemed hesitant to greet them, caught in the tension between siding with the HOA and staying neutral. The narrator began documenting everything. Photos of the gate, photos of the property lines, copies of old deeds showing where the HOA's reach ended. He knew what Karen was doing. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. And if she was willing to bend the truth once, she would do it again. The tension simmered through the summer, each week bringing a new petty complaint, each letter escalating in tone. But the moment that turned the simmer into a boil came one humid afternoon when the narrator's wife returned to the cabin alone. She unlocked the gate, carrying groceries from her car when she noticed flashing lights in her rearview mirror. Another patrol car, another complaint. Karen had called 911 again, this time claiming that the wife was trespassing on restricted land. The dispatcher had no choice but to send someone, and once again the officer arrived to find nothing resembling a crime. But the very act of seeing blue lights in her driveway made the wife's hands tremble with anger. It was harassment. It was intimidation, and it was only getting worse. What neither she nor her husband realized in that moment was that Karen had already filed something bigger. An official petition with the HOA to seize maintenance authority over the gate and access road. She was laying the groundwork for a much larger conflict, one that would test not just patience, but ownership itself. The cabin by the lake was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battleground, and the lock on the gate was the spark that had lit the fire. And as summer turned into fall, the couple began to realize that the real fight had only just begun. The second complaint left more than just frustration behind. It left a realization. Karen wasn't going to stop. Calling 911 once might have been a mistake, a lapse of judgment from someone who didn't know the limits of her authority. But twice? That revealed intent. She wasn't reporting crime. She was trying to create it. The couple returned to the cabin the following weekend, determined not to let her antics spoil what had always been their peaceful retreat. Yet the moment they drove up, the evidence of her interference was impossible to ignore. A bright orange notice had been taped to their gate, stamped with the HOA's logo, declaring the property in violation of community standards. The notice listed 3 alleged infractions: unauthorized alteration of common property, failure to seek approval for structural modifications, and non-compliance with access regulations. The language was sharp, the threats unmistakable: removal of the lock, fines of $500 per week, and the possibility of legal action. But what struck hardest was the phrase common property. The gate had stood on their family land for decades, predating the HOA itself. There was no clause, no map, no record that gave the association authority over that entrance. Karen had simply written it as fact, twisting language until truth bent to her will. The narrator's wife tore the notice down and folded it neatly into her bag. She refused to let Karen's paper threats linger as if they carried weight. Yet deep down, both she and her husband knew that ignoring it would only embolden their neighbor. Karen thrived on silence, on the fear of confrontation. If they wanted this to end, they would need to push back. The first step was gathering proof. The narrator drove to the county records office, pulling dusty ledgers and printed plats that mapped the lake's surrounding lots. Sure enough, the deed made it clear. The cabin land was privately owned, the access road a right-of-way, and the gate firmly within their boundaries. The HOA had no jurisdiction. No vote, no rule, no signature could overwrite those facts. Yet knowing the truth and proving it were two different things. Karen's influence over the HOA board was strong. She had cultivated years of dominance through intimidation and persistence. Few residents wanted to challenge her because they feared the constant stream of fines and harassment that would follow. Her power was less about authority and more about exhaustion. People complied simply because they didn't have the strength to fight. But the narrator and his wife weren't like the others. This wasn't just about a lock or a gate. This was about principle, about a sanctuary under siege. And so they documented everything. Photographs of the gate, screenshots of the county records, timestamps of Karen's SUV parked near the property. Each piece of evidence was added to a growing file, a shield against her accusations. Still, Karen escalated. Within days of the notice, another letter arrived. This one claimed that their refusal to comply had triggered formal enforcement proceedings. It threatened court involvement and cited vague state statutes in bold letters, none of which actually applied to the situation. The intimidation was clear. Karen was hoping they would give up before the truth caught up. And yet, perhaps the most telling escalation wasn't written at all. It was physical. Neighbors began to whisper about Karen's late-night walks down the gravel road. Some said she lingered near the gate with a flashlight, inspecting the lock as if she might find a reason to pry it open. Others claimed they saw her photographing cars that parked nearby, compiling her own evidence for whatever scheme she was brewing. Each sighting added to the sense of unease. It was no longer just about harassment, it was about surveillance. Then came the third call to law enforcement. On a damp September evening, the narrator's wife arrived at the cabin alone once again. She had barely stepped out of her car when another patrol car appeared at the gate. This time, the officer was visibly weary, as though he'd been here before, and he had. The dispatcher's notes revealed that the complaint had come from the same caller, Karen. But instead of accusations of trespassing or tampering, the complaint was stranger. Karen had told the dispatcher that the wife was blocking emergency access to the lake road by locking the gate. She framed it as a public safety hazard, as though the cabin's security measures endangered the entire community. The officer inspected the gate, noted that the right-of-way had not been obstructed, and once again found nothing resembling a violation. Yet the constant presence of law enforcement was beginning to wear on the couple. Each call might have ended in dismissal, but each flashing light carried a weight. It made their private retreat feel less like home and more like a contested frontier. The couple reached a turning point that night. They decided that instead of waiting for the next letter or the next false report, they would go directly to the HOA board. They would present their evidence, state their claim, and force Karen to face the truth in front of witnesses. But Karen anticipated their move. By the time they attended the next board meeting, Karen had already filled the room with her narrative. She had circulated emails painting them as difficult, uncooperative, even dangerous. She described them as people who disregarded rules, who put the community at risk, who refused to work together. For residents who didn't know the full story, her version sounded convincing. After all, she was the president, and presidents carried credibility. The narrator stood in that meeting with a folder of documents under his arm, watching the room shift uneasily between two stories. On one side was Karen's polished fabrication, dripping with authority. On the other was the cold truth of property lines and deeds. He presented the evidence calmly, methodically, leaving no detail unchecked. He laid the county map on the table, showed the dated signatures, pointed to the boundary that excluded the HOA's reach. He made it clear. The gate was not theirs, the lock was not their decision, and no rule they passed could change that. For a brief moment, silence filled the room. Some board members shifted in their chairs, suddenly aware that the foundation of Karen's crusade was crumbling. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to challenge her directly. Karen's face flushed, but she didn't concede. Instead, she doubled down. She insisted the documents were outdated. She claimed new regulations had superseded the old. She argued with such conviction that it seemed, for a fleeting second, as though the truth itself was negotiable. The board adjourned without resolution. No fines were rescinded, no declarations were withdrawn. It ended in limbo, suspended between facts and fabrications, truth and persistence. Yet in that limbo, one thing had become clear. The battle was no longer about property. It was about dominance. Karen couldn't afford to lose because losing meant weakness, and weakness wasn't something she could tolerate. The narrator and his wife left that meeting knowing the war was far from over. Karen would not back down, not willingly. And if the board refused to rein her in, the fight would spill beyond their small community. The lock had started the storm, but now the storm was growing wider, darker, and far more dangerous. The board's indecision left a vacuum, and Karen wasted no time filling it. Within a week, the narrator and his wife found a new envelope in their mailbox. Not a letter from the HOA this time, but an official notice from the county courthouse. It was a summons, listing them as defendants in a civil complaint filed by the HOA. The accusations mirrored everything Karen had been repeating for weeks. Unauthorized alterations, obstruction of common property, failure to comply with regulations. The words on the paper looked heavier, more threatening than her flimsy notices taped to the gate. This was no longer the realm of neighborhood politics. This was legal warfare. The wife felt the weight immediately. Court meant lawyers. Lawyers meant money. and money meant months of stress piled on top of something that had once been so simple, a lock on a gate to protect their family retreat. But as the narrator flipped through the complaint, frustration gave way to determination. The HOA's case was riddled with inconsistencies. The property lines in the attached exhibits didn't match official county records. The so-called community gate was listed as a shared access point despite decades of deed history proving otherwise. Karen had filed the lawsuit with the same arrogance she showed in her meetings, assuming persistence would outweigh accuracy. The couple decided they would fight it, not only to protect themselves but to set a precedent. If Karen could twist the truth into legal action, what would stop her from targeting others? They hired an attorney who specialized in property disputes. The man was older, deliberate, with the patience of someone who had seen plenty of overreaching HOAs try and fail. He flipped through their evidence with a slow nod, as if each page confirmed what he already suspected. He explained that cases like these often came down to intimidation, that the HOA banked on fear more than facts. But when faced with the right documentation, their arguments rarely held up. Even so, Karen wasn't slowing down. While the court prepared its schedule, she kept pressing in the background. More notices, more patrol cars. Another complaint filed about unauthorized landscaping when the couple trimmed brush near the dock. Her campaign was relentless. A drip of irritation meant to exhaust them before they even entered the courtroom. But her tactics were beginning to wear thin with others. Neighbors whispered about the sheriff's growing impatience. Each 911 call was logged, each false complaint recorded. Officers were required to respond, but many had started noting Karen's name in their reports with a sigh. One deputy reportedly said she was crying wolf so often that no one even looks up anymore. The HOA board, too, began to fracture. Some members grew uncomfortable with how far Karen had taken things. They joined to manage budgets, maintain landscaping, and keep the community in order, not to fund lawsuits over locks and gates that weren't even theirs. Quietly, a few began reaching out to the narrator and his wife, offering words of support, though never publicly. No one wanted to face Karen head-on. The court date arrived on a chilly October morning. The couple walked into the courthouse carrying their folder of evidence, while Karen marched in with a stack of binders, her face set with the smug certainty of someone who had never admitted defeat. She had brought the HOA's attorney, a sharp-suited man who spoke quickly, as though confidence alone could win the case. The hearing stretched for hours. Karen's lawyer argued about community standards, about safety regulations, about shared access. He painted the gate as though it were a communal lifeline, a vital road that all residents had the right to control. His words flowed like a story rehearsed too many times. But when the judge asked for documentation, cracks appeared. The HOA's exhibits were incomplete. Their maps were outdated. Their bylaws made no reference to the cabin's road or gate. And when the narrator's attorney presented the original deed, signed decades before the HOA even existed, the courtroom shifted. The paper spoke louder than Karen's persistence. Karen tried to interject, her voice rising as though sheer volume could rewrite the facts. She insisted the community had assumed responsibility over the years. She claimed precedent, practice, expectation. But none of those things equaled ownership, and the judge reminded her of that fact in clipped, firm words. The ruling was not immediate, but the direction was clear. The court recognized the gate as private property. The lock was lawful. The HOA had no jurisdiction, no authority, and no grounds for enforcement. For the couple, it was a moment of relief, but also caution. Karen had lost a battle, but they knew her well enough to suspect she wouldn't accept defeat gracefully. She would retreat, regroup, and strike again. And sure enough, the days following the hearing were thick with tension. Karen avoided eye contact in passing, but her SUV still appeared near the cabin, parked at odd hours, engine idling as though she was waiting for something. The letters stopped, but the silence felt more ominous than the noise. Then came the break the couple hadn't expected, an ally from within the HOA itself. One of the quieter board members, a man who had remained in Karen's shadow for years, reached out privately. He explained that many on the board were fed up with her leadership. They had tolerated her micromanaging because it kept the community orderly, but the lawsuit had crossed a line. It had drained resources, embarrassed the association, and exposed them to legal risk. This board member revealed something else, too. Karen was facing pressure from outside the community. The sheriff's office had formally warned her about abusing 911 services. Repeated false complaints could result in charges. She was furious, cornered, and more unstable than ever. For the couple, this was both reassuring and alarming. On one hand, Karen was losing credibility. On the other, cornered people often made desperate moves. And as autumn deepened, they began to sense that the real storm was still coming. The courtroom had drawn boundaries on paper, but Karen wasn't finished. Her authority was slipping, her image cracking, and she was the kind of person who would burn everything down before admitting defeat. The cabin, once their sanctuary, still felt under siege. The lock had held, the deed had protected them, but Karen's shadow loomed larger than ever. They had won in court, but the war for peace at the lake was far from over. The courtroom defeat had left Karen humiliated, but humiliation rarely softened her resolve. If anything, it hardened it. She could no longer rely on bylaws or legal threats to bend others to her will. Her authority was fractured, her credibility questioned, and yet her obsession with control over the lake cabin grew even more unhinged. For weeks after the ruling, her SUV appeared near the property almost daily. Sometimes it was parked across the road, other times idling at the end of the gravel path. Neighbors noticed whispering about her fixation. They began to wonder whether this was still about the HOA at all, or whether it had become something more personal, something darker. The couple kept documenting everything. Each time Karen lingered, they photographed the vehicle. Each time she slowed past the gate, they marked the time. They knew that if the harassment escalated, those records would matter. But what they couldn't anticipate was just how far Karen was willing to go in her final attempt to reassert dominance. It happened on a cold November afternoon. The lake was still, the trees bare, the cabin quiet. The wife had gone ahead to prepare the place for winter, stacking firewood and locking windows against the coming frost. She had barely settled inside when the sound of sirens split the silence. 2 patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing against the fading daylight. Behind them came a fire truck, its horn blaring as it crawled down the narrow road. The wife stepped outside, confused, only to find Karen standing near the gate, gesturing wildly to the officers. The accusation this time was unlike any before. Karen had called 911 claiming there was a gas leak at the cabin, a potential explosion waiting to happen. She insisted the property posed an immediate danger to the community. The call had been frantic, urgent, designed to trigger the highest possible response. And it worked. Emergency services had rolled in as though they were arriving at a disaster site. But once again, reality betrayed her story. The firefighters inspected the cabin, the road, the surrounding property. They found nothing. No leak, no hazard, no risk. The wife stood by, arms folded tightly, watching the officers exchange weary looks. This time, something shifted. It wasn't just another false alarm. It was the culmination of every fabricated complaint, every wasted hour of law enforcement's time. And the sheriff's deputies had reached their limit. Karen tried to spin the situation as a misunderstanding, claiming she had smelled something from the road, that she was only trying to protect the neighborhood. But her words carried no weight anymore. The officers knew her record. They had stacks of reports with her name on them, and this time they didn't leave with a warning. They pulled her aside, spoke firmly, and then placed her in handcuffs. For the first time, Karen's reign of intimidation had tangible consequences. She was arrested for filing false emergency reports, for misuse of 911 services, for harassment. The neighbors who gathered along the road watched in stunned silence as the woman who had once ruled the HOA with an iron grip was guided into the back of a patrol car. News of the arrest spread quickly through the community. For years, Karen had been untouchable, her persistence enough to make even the boldest residents back down. But now, the myth of her power crumbled. Board members who once followed her out of fear began to distance themselves. Residents who had tolerated her scrutiny started speaking openly about her behavior. The silence that had fueled her control was finally broken. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting within days. Without Karen's presence, the tone was different, calmer, more reasonable. They voted unanimously to remove her as president, citing not only the lawsuit's failure, but also the embarrassment her actions had brought on the community. For the first time in years, the HOA felt less like a weapon and more like what it was meant to be, a group of neighbors maintaining shared spaces. For the narrator and his wife, the shift was palpable. Letters stopped arriving. Patrol cars no longer slowed near the cabin. The gate stood firm with its lock untouched, unchallenged. What had begun as a simple act of protection had spiraled into a storm of harassment, yet somehow the storm had cleared. The wife stood by the lake one morning, watching the sun rise across the water, the reflection stretching across ripples of gold. For months, the cabin had felt like contested ground, every visit clouded by tension. But now, in the silence of dawn, it felt like home again. The lock was still there, but it no longer symbolized conflict. It symbolized resilience. Neighbors began to approach the couple differently, some with apologies, others with quiet thanks. They admitted they had been too afraid to challenge Karen, too drained to resist her constant demands. Watching someone finally stand up to her and prevail had changed the atmosphere of the entire neighborhood. It gave them permission to reclaim their peace. Karen's downfall was not glamorous. Her arrest became a footnote in local news, her absence at meetings a relief rather than a loss. Eventually, her house went up for sale. Rumor had it she was moving to another town, another HOA, another stage where she might attempt to rebuild her illusion of power. But here by the lake, her era was finished. The narrator and his wife never forgot the ordeal. They kept the file of documents, the court ruling, the photographs. Not out of fear that it would all happen again, but as a reminder of what persistence could withstand. They had faced down intimidation, surveillance, lawsuits, and false emergencies, yet through it all, the truth had held. The cabin by the lake had survived. And so had they. In the end, the story wasn't just about a lock or a gate. It was about the collapse of a bully's reign, the restoration of a community's voice, and the quiet strength of a couple who refused to bow. And though Karen had tried to make their sanctuary a battleground, what remained after her downfall was exactly what they had fought for from the beginning: peace. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you don't want to miss the next wild HOA and Karen drama, subscribe and turn on the bell for more unbelievable stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.